I am Inspector, and I solve mystery. Welcome to my new case.
I remember that evening with a clarity so fine it feels almost spidery, a thread stretched taut between past and present. The air had turned the color of tarnished pewter, damp enough to smudge one's cuffs, and the final bell of All Souls tolled not as a summons, but as a fading remark upon the day. From where I sat in the pub across the lane, the sound arrived softened, like an organ note heard through closed doors. In the college quad, a porter moved slowly, his coat collar raised, and placed his hand on a stone bench where a small white cup rested. Steam coiled up in a reluctant spiral. He hesitated, as though the warmth might scald his palm, and then withdrew. I noticed it through the pub window between sips of tepid whiskey, as one notices the flicker of a lamp one has no intention of replacing. Inside, the jukebox had chosen Mahler, or perhaps I had. It was the Adagio from the 10th, a movement I've always found almost too candid. The barmaid, whose name I'd never properly caught, wiped the counter in slow arcs. My crossword lay folded beside me. A clue about emptiness refused to yield. 5 letters, a hint of reversal in the wording. I penciled in void and then erased it. The rubber left a smudge like ash. Lewis had gone off to visit his cousin in Banbury. I was alone with the hum of rain against the windows. In that particular public house, the wallpaper bore faint silhouettes of framed prints long removed, and the smell of old beer mingled with the sharper scent of polish. Above me, a television murmured a weather forecast no one watched. I thought about the bell. Its echo belonged to another century, yet here it was, creeping under the door like a familiar reproach. I turned back to the puzzle. The setter had used the word brim in an earlier clue, and now emptiness. Some private theme, perhaps. My eyes strayed again to the window. The porter had gone. The cup remained. Steam still rose. Such persistence of heat suggested a presence only just departed. There was a small droplet on the stone beside it, a bead of liquid that the rain had not yet dispersed. In Oxford, one becomes accustomed to small mysteries. A door left ajar in a college otherwise sealed. A bicycle chained for weeks and then vanished overnight. Yet something about that cup, so ordinary, lodged in me. It was not the drink itself, but the tableau. Warmth abandoned, stone enduring, a hand hesitant. The bell's last tone seemed to have curled itself around it. I shifted on the bench seat, aware of my own restlessness. Mahler's Adagio reached a passage of hesitant uplift before subsiding again, like someone trying and failing to speak. I refilled my glass. The crossword clue, when read backwards, suggested null. I wrote it in, unsatisfied. A man at the far end of the bar muttered to himself about a meeting. His raincoat steamed gently. The barmaid offered him a damp beer mat without words. In my head I began to sketch a pattern from the bell to the cup to the clue, though I could not have said why. Perhaps this is how cases begin, not with facts, but with an atmosphere. A note of discord, a misplaced object, a fragment of language wrongly remembered. I rose at last, leaving coins on the counter, and stepped out. The rain had thinned to a mist. Across the lane the quad lay empty but for the bench. The cup was still there. Its handle faced inward now, toward the wall, as though someone had turned it in a small act of courtesy. The porter's footsteps echoed faintly from the far arch. I did not cross to the bench. Instead, I stood under the gateway and listened to the final drip of water from the stone tracery. My hand, without my willing it, adjusted the lapel of my coat. Somewhere, a window slammed. Somewhere else, a clock began the slow climb toward another hour. I thought again of the clue and of Mahler's melody and felt that peculiar stirring of curiosity I have never been able to resist. Not yet an investigation, only the faint smell of one, like smoke under a door. I watched the steam unravel into the night until it was no longer visible, and then turned away, carrying with me the image of a cup full, a bottle empty, and a bell whose echo still trembled against the stones. It was still early when Lewis came to find me, though the sky above St. Giles already carried that greyish sheen which belongs neither to dawn nor to any honest daylight. He arrived with the thin file tucked under his arm, like a hymn book, damp around the edges from the mist. I was nursing a second coffee at the window of my flat, the radio murmuring a string quartet whose composer I had forgotten. Lewis said, "She's gone, sir," and set the file on the sill without sitting. The she needed no elaboration. I opened the folder and found her name. Dr. Margaret Hail, Fellow of All Souls. The paper smelled faintly of rain and pencil shavings. There were photographs, taken by someone brisk, clinical, indifferent. A narrow room, books lined like soldiers, and in the middle a small table with two objects fixed in a curious harmony, a bottle of Burgundy drained halfway, and a teacup still full, steam fogging the lens. Beside them, an unsigned letter. Lewis told me she'd been found at 8:30 by the scout. The coroner would likely call it suicide. Pills from a prescription for migraines mixed with wine. He mentioned the university's embarrassment, the tidy desire for closure. I half listened, tracing the outline of the photograph. Margaret's face was turned away, only a fall of greying hair against the pillow. I'd heard her lecture once, years ago, on the Victorian poets. She had quoted Arnold with a voice that almost trembled, as though the line belonged to her alone. Lewis cleared his throat. "They found this letter, sir." He handed me a photocopy. The lines of verse were familiar, but not quite right, like a tune whistled slightly off-key. Arnold again, but misremembered. The handwriting elegant, slanted, dark ink, fading at the eye edges. It bore no signature. I folded it back along its crease. And then I noticed it. 2 different folds. One deep and old, pressed flat as a scar, the other fresher, sharp, a diagonal across the first. I ran my thumb along them, feeling the shift in texture. It had been folded long ago, perhaps tucked into a book, then reopened and folded anew. Why? By whom? Lewis was describing the pills, the wine, the sister on her way from Bath. I murmured something vague, still looking at the page. The misquoted line altered the sense. What should have been faith became farewell. Small, but telling. I asked about the Burgundy. From her own cellar? No, sir. From a crate reserved for visiting donors, according to the butler. Strange, I said, though not to him. In my mind a pattern began to stir, faint as smoke under a door. A letter travelled, hidden, altered. A bottle drawn from the wrong shelf. A cup of tea left untouched yet full, its heat still lingering for the scout to see. Lewis shifted on his feet. He disliked my silences. "Shall I set up the interview with the bursar, sir?" I said yes, though my voice sounded distracted even to me. After he left, I sat down, spreading the letter, the photographs, and my notebook on the table. The string quartet had ended. The radio now gave only static. Outside, bicycles hissed along the wet pavement. I stared at the double crease until the paper blurred. It was not proof of anything, not yet. Only an echo of hands long gone, folding and unfolding a message whose meaning had shifted like light on water. I wrote in my notebook, misquote, double fold, wrong bottle. Then I closed the file. Somewhere in the back of my head a line from Arnold returned, correctly this time as she had once spoken it. The difference between her memory and the one in the letter felt like a faint draft creeping under a closed door. I poured myself a small measure of whiskey and held it without drinking. Already the case smelled less of tragedy than of arrangement. But arrangement by whom, and for what end, lay folded still, waiting to be opened. Lewis and I stepped through the north gate as the porter locked it behind us, his keys jangling like small iron bells. The college at that hour had the stillness of an emptied theatre. Rain lay in thin films on the flagstones, turning the quad into a dark mirror where windows flickered faintly. My shoes made a hush of sound on the worn steps. I've always thought Oxford looks most honest in its winter damp, the stones showing every century of its age, the air thick with the smell of wet leaves and charred paper from the library's chimneys. We began our circuit slowly. Lewis carried the list of names, but did not read from it. He muttered that the place felt like a cloister built for ghosts. I told him that scholars are simply ghosts who have not yet realized it. He did not reply. The college buildings pressed close on either side, their doors shut with the finality of bank vaults. Each window seemed to conceal a face just withdrawn. Professor Latimer was the first to receive us. His room smelled of pipe ash and damp velvet. A pile of papers on his desk bore a title page scarred by red ink. His long-delayed monograph on Arnold, postponed again and again. He spoke with that brittle courtesy cultivated by disappointed men. Margaret Hail had been talented, but, he said, reckless with her citations. I noticed a half-finished crossword on his side table. The clue for rival remained blank. His hand hovered above it when he saw me looking, then withdrew. We left him staring into the fire, lips moving around a line from Sophocles as though it were a prayer. Outside, Lewis asked if I believed him. I said belief was too expensive a luxury at this stage. Helen Dacre's room lay in the newer wing. Books stacked like barricades around a narrow bed, walls tacked with photographs of lecture ships elsewhere. She offered us tea but poured none for herself. Her voice was light, eager to be misunderstood. Margaret, she said, had promised to recommend her for a fellowship but had not. I asked about the evening of the death. She looked at the rain on the window and said she had been writing in the library until closing. When I mentioned the misquoted poem, she blinked, as if at a sudden flash. A small ink mark on her thumb betrayed recent letter-writing, though she had claimed not to know of any correspondence. We crossed the quad again, the rain now a soft hiss. Edward Blythe's office smelled of furniture polish and worry. The bursar's suit was immaculate, yet a thread dangled from his cuff. He offered us sherry from a decanter already half empty. His tone was urbane, amused at the college's appetite for scandal. Margaret, he said, had been naive about finances. When I asked who had access to the donor's burgundy, he smiled without showing his teeth and said only those on the cellar list, which included him. Lewis coughed into his sleeve. I noticed a small slip of paper peeking from a ledger on Blythe's desk. An invoice with yesterday's date, folded twice. Father Kershaw awaited us in the chapel vestry, the smell of candle wax and damp cassocks filling the air. He spoke quietly, his eyes lowered. Margaret had been a soul in torment, he murmured, though she wore learning as a mask. He admitted to writing her letters of spiritual counsel, but denied sending anything recently. When I repeated a line from the misquoted Arnold verse, he corrected it automatically, as though the true version still lived in his throat. A drop of wax clung to his sleeve, unbrushed away. Our last encounter of the evening took place not in the college, but at a small lodging house off Banbury Road. Ruth Carling opened the door herself, her expression composed like an actress before curtain rise. She said she had been estranged from her sister for years, that their father's estate had divided them. She spoke of Margaret's brilliance with a kind of weary admiration. On the mantel lay a library book from All Souls, due back 2 days before the death. We walked back toward the gate, the mist thickening, the bells of another college ringing far off. Lewis asked which of them I favored for guilt. I told him suspicion was a courtyard with many locked doors. We had rattled the handles. Nothing more. Yet as we left, I kept seeing the folded invoice in Blythe's ledger, the ink mark on Helen's thumb, the unfinished crossword in Latimer's room. Small tremors, like mice beneath the floorboards, hinting at a larger movement unseen. The porter let us out without a word. Behind us, the gates shut with a sound like a verdict deferred. I looked back once at the lit windows, each a square of secrecy in the dark stone. The rain had ceased, leaving the quad glistening, a chessboard awaiting its next move. The porter's lodge at All Souls has a smell all its own, a blend of wax polish, damp coats, and the dust that rises invisibly from old registers. I remember sitting there on a hard wooden chair while the rain ticked against the leaded windows. Lewis had gone off to fetch a statement from the kitchen staff, leaving me with nothing but the sound of the clock and the soft shuffle of the porter's shoes on the mat. He hummed under his breath as he sorted keys. Each hook on the wall held a sliver of someone's life, brass tags glinting faintly like medals. I had brought a crossword with me, folded into my notebook. It had been set by the same compiler who had used emptiness in an earlier puzzle, and today's clue read reversals. 5 letters, with a hint of metamorphosis in the phrasing. I filled in turn, then erased it. The rubber left a grey ghost across the square. My mind drifted back to Margaret Hail, to the still full cup of tea, to the letter folded twice. I felt the familiar itch of a pattern forming just beyond reach. The visitor register lay open on the counter, its pages ruled with careful lines and blotches of blue ink. I turned it idly, as one flicks through a stranger's album. Names written with varying confidence, addresses curling across counties, initials pressed like fingerprints. On the date of Margaret's final lecture, I found what looked at first glance ordinary. A signature beginning with a false initial, so small a slip it might have been a tremor of the hand. Yet the surname was unmistakable, and the pen had hesitated before the second letter, leaving a dot of ink like a pinprick. Someone had disguised their presence only enough to comfort themselves. The porter glanced at me once but said nothing. His humming stopped when he reached for a key from the top row. Outside, the rain deepened to a steady hiss, and a bicycle bell rang somewhere across the quad. I tapped my pencil against the crossword, reading the clue again. Reversals. Not merely change, but inversion, a turning back. I thought of the folded letter, creased once long ago, then again recently. A reversal of something hidden, represented under a different shape. On the lodge wall hung a faded anthology of college verse, a centenary gift, its spine cracked. I had seen it once in the library, with Margaret's notes in the margin. I rose and lifted it down, letting the pages fall open. There it was. The same line from Arnold, printed correctly, not as in the letter. In the margin, a pencil mark, faint but deliberate, reversing the words into the misquote I had found at her bedside. I traced it with my thumb and felt the paper's roughness like a pulse beneath skin. I sat back down. The porter began humming again, softer now. In the register, on the date of the lecture, the visitor's hand had written a time but not a departure. No exit recorded. A small omission, but it stirred the air of the lodge like a draught. My pencil moved across the crossword, writing in volte. Italian for turn, reversal, change of direction. 5 letters, it fitted. Lewis returned with his notes, shaking rain from his coat. He asked if I had found anything. I said only that sometimes people leave traces where they believe they have erased them. He looked puzzled, but did not press. We stepped out together into the damp quad, the porter's humming following us like a faint echo. As we walked, I felt the first thin edge of something stage-managed rather than spontaneous. A letter altered, a bottle from the wrong crate, a false initial on a day of importance. Small acts of theatre performed in quiet rooms. The rain on the stone had grown colder, sharper. Somewhere in the chapel, a single note of an organ sounded and then ceased, as though testing the silence. I kept the crossword folded in my pocket, the word volte circled in pencil, and with it the knowledge that what lay ahead would not be straightforward, but a series of turns, reversals, and concealed exits. The cellar master led me down a flight of worn stone steps that smelled of mildew and cork dust. The air grew cooler with each turn, until it felt like stepping into a memory. A single bulb swayed above our heads, casting a thin light over rows of burgundy bottles, cradled in wire racks. He moved with the patience of a man who has no need of clocks. "These are for donors only," he said, touching one crate as though it were a reliquary. "We log every bottle. The one you asked about, 1978 Clos de Vougeuse, was drawn from this section 2 nights before her death." His finger hovered above an entry in the ledger, an ink stroke thicker than the others, a signature blurred where someone had closed the book too soon. I bent over the page. The handwriting was familiar in its caution, but not its formality. A script attempting to look official. The cellar master watched me without expression. "Only fellows, the bursar and the chaplain sign here," he said. "It is never the guests." I asked if Margaret Hail herself had taken the wine. He shook his head once. She preferred Sancerre. When I climbed back up into the courtyard, the afternoon light had turned the stone a pale green. Lewis waited by the gate with another file. The solicitor had sent over a draft of Margaret's new will, dated 2 days before her death. He handed it to me without comment. The pages smelled of fresh toner and old dust. The beneficiary named within, a single initial, no surname, meant nothing to either of us. Her handwriting filled the margins with small corrections, as though she had been uncertain even at the last moment. I felt a faint ache behind my eyes, the beginning of a thought without a shape. We parted at the chapel steps. Lewis had errands. I went inside for evensong, not from piety, but from habit. The choir's first notes drifted upward like smoke, gathering beneath the carved ceiling. I sat near the back, the draught from the door curling around my ankles. Father Kershaw stood at the lectern, reading from his notes with a voice too even to be natural. His hands trembled slightly when he reached the poem inserted into the order of service. It was Arnold again, the same verse misquoted in Margaret's final letter. Yet here, too, he altered a word, softening faith into farewell. It might have been an accident of memory, but the shift was identical. I closed my eyes. The music swelled and then thinned, as though testing the acoustics of silence. Around me, candles guttered in their brass stands. I thought of the burgundy bottle taken from a crate meant for donors, of a will altered to favor no one visible, of a chaplain quietly changing words he surely knew by heart. Each fragment hovered, unjoined, like scattered notes of a theme I'd once heard in a Mahler adagio and could not hum back. When the service ended, I remained seated. People filed out in polite rows. Kershaw paused at the door to greet a student, his eyes flicking toward me only once. The smell of candle wax clung to his sleeve. I felt my usual mixture of weariness and a darker curiosity, the sense that behind these gestures, behind the wine and the will and the whispered verse, someone had arranged a pattern of signs, trusting that no one would read them in the right order. Outside, the evening rain had begun again, a thin scatter against the cloister windows. I stood beneath the archway, thinking of Margaret Hail, who had once spoken the same lines without error, her voice steady as a bow drawn across a string. My cynicism, which I like to pretend is armor, felt less like protection and more like a bruise one presses to keep awake. Somewhere in the college, a door closed softly, as though sealing a secret. The college archive sat at the end of a narrow corridor whose carpet smelt faintly of mothballs and rain-soaked wool. Even in daylight, it felt like dusk there, the high windows smeared with condensation, the wood paneling darkened by decades of polish and silence. I had asked the porter for the key that morning, though he looked at me as though the place were a crypt rather than a repository. In truth, the archives of Oxford are both, Inside, the air was cool, laced with the sweetness of paper slowly dying. The librarian moved between the shelves with the care of someone tending a fragile garden. She was younger than the stacks, but carried the same stillness, her gestures small and exact. I had seen her before at evensong, head bowed, hands folded. When she saw me, she asked if I wanted the Hail papers. Her voice barely disturbed the air. She led me to a table where boxes waited like parcels long undelivered. The lids gave a soft sigh as she opened them. I began to sift through programs, lecture notes, minutes of committees, the usual strata of academic life. Nothing stirred until I reached a small brown envelope labeled Photographs 1973 to 75. It contained half a dozen prints, edges curling, colors leached to sepia. One image caught at me. Margaret Hail in her 20s, seated on a stone bench, hair pinned loosely, a book balanced on her knee. Beside her stood Latimer, then a man with a shock of dark hair and a cigarette held like a scepter, and behind them, half in shadow, Edward Blythe, expression unreadable. They looked as though caught mid-conspiracy or mid-laughter. I could not tell which. The photograph had been torn along the bottom margin, a rough strip missing where a dedication might once have run. The tear was not accidental. The paper fibers bent inward as though someone had folded and ripped it with deliberate pressure. I turned it over. On the back, a faint imprint of writing pressed into the card, the ghosts of letters from a pen no longer present. Only a few curves remained, enough to suggest an M and perhaps a date. My thumb traced them absently. In the hush of the archive, even that felt loud. The librarian watched me from a polite distance. At last, she said softly that the photograph had been returned out of order years ago, slid between other papers as if by mistake. Her eyes flicked to the torn edge, then away. "People forget," she said, "or pretend to." I asked her what had been forgotten. She hesitated, adjusting the collar of her cardigan. "There was a student then," she said, "who took a paper from the exam office and later jumped from the library roof. It was never proven who helped him." Her words hung in the air like dust motes. I asked if Margaret's name had been linked. The librarian did not answer directly. "Only that some photographs carry more than images," she murmured, and busied herself with a stack of journals. A small blush rose to her cheeks, whether from memory or my presence I could not tell. I sat with the photograph a long while, the smell of aging paper in my nostrils, the rain tapping the high window panes. My notebook lay open beside me, a half-finished crossword in the corner. The clue read, "Unseen companion, 6 letters." I wrote in shadow and then paused. Looking again at the photograph, at Blythe's posture behind the bench, I felt the stir of a thought, a presence behind, unacknowledged, shaping what lay before. The librarian returned with another box, but I waved it away. I had seen enough for now. Sliding the photograph back into its envelope felt like closing a drawer on a breath. The missing margin, the ghosts of letters, the librarian's whisper of scandal. They were not yet evidence, only the tremor of a hidden current. As I left the archive, the corridor's carpet muted my steps. The door clicked softly behind me, like a camera shutter closing. Outside, the quad lay wet and empty, the bell tower dark against a silver sky. In my coat pocket, the crossword waited, its empty squares as blank as the torn edge of the photograph. I went to see Ruth Carling alone, though Lewis had urged me to bring him. The house on Banbury Road stood behind a curtain of damp ivy, windows clouded as though someone had been breathing on them from inside. She opened the door herself, wearing a dark coat she had not yet unbuttoned, as though uncertain whether to let me in or send me away. The hallway smelled faintly of lavender polish and paper gone soft at the edges. She led me into a parlor whose furniture looked like inherited obligations. On a low table lay letters tied with a green ribbon, their corners frayed, and a library book from All Souls half hidden beneath them. She sat, but did not offer me a chair. Lewis thinks she's the one, I thought, the blackmailing sister whose alibi had already begun to buckle under the weight of its own precision. Yet she met my gaze with a composure that felt less like defiance than fatigue. We spoke of her father's estate, of Margaret's success, of the resentments that had thickened between them over the years. She said she had been in Bath on the night of Margaret's death, arriving by train that morning and leaving again after a cousin's dinner. She said it as if the details might exonerate her by their neatness. I let the words settle before asking which station she had used. She answered without hesitation, naming a line I knew to have been closed that day for repairs. A small slip, like a pinhole in an airtight bag. I looked at the letters on the table. The green ribbon was tied twice, once tight, once loose. My fingers itched to untie it, but I did not. Instead, I asked if she had been in touch with her sister recently. She said only through solicitors, a thin smile flickering and dying. In the corner of the room a clock ticked, a sound too loud for its size. Later, walking back through the drizzle, I replayed the conversation in my mind. Lewis would call it a confession by carelessness. He would say she invented her journey and misstepped on the detail. Perhaps he would be right. But I have learned that lies can be built from truths arranged at odd angles, and that the innocent misremember timetables as easily as the guilty. We met in the porter's lodge, Lewis arriving flushed from the rain, his notes damp. He said, "She's the one, sir. She tried to bleed Margaret over the will, and it went wrong." I said, perhaps. He frowned. On the counter lay my crossword from that morning. The clue read, "Vessel untouched." 5 letters. I had written cup, then erased it, then written brim. None satisfied. The image of Margaret's room returned to me, the half-empty burgundy bottle, the untouched tea still giving off a thread of steam. The contrast had haunted me from the first photograph. Wine drunk, tea ignored. Inversion, reversal, performance. Someone had wanted us to see despair and domesticity at once. Lewis asked what I was thinking. I told him only that an alibi collapsing does not always reveal a killer, sometimes only a frightened witness. He said, "You don't believe she did it?" I said, "Belief is a luxury." He looked at me as though I had betrayed him. We walked out together into the quad. The rain had stopped, but left the stones slick and dark. Bells from another college drifted over the roof lines. My mind circled not Ruth's slip about the train, not the green ribbon on the letters, but the quiet puzzle of that full cup and empty bottle. The scene arranged like a still life for a viewer, yet unnamed. In the archway, a student passed, carrying a violin case. I caught a faint note as he brushed by, a phrase from Mahler, of all things. It lingered like a question I could not yet form. I paused under the arch, the crossword folded in my pocket, Lewis already striding ahead. Some cases advance by confession or evidence. This one moved by shadows and small inversions, a pattern glimpsed only from the corner of the eye. The Randolphs' lounge that evening smelled of polished mahogany and damp umbrellas, a scent I have always associated with moments of uneasy clarity. I chose a table near the window where the rain streaked the glass, like a half-erased notation. The waiter set down a small whiskey without my asking, a gesture born of habit rather than sympathy. Somewhere behind the bar, a scratched recording of Tosca played on an old machine, the aria swelling and retreating as though the tape itself were breathing. I had come to think. The word reversal had been circling me all day, like a hawk that refuses to land. In the cellar, in the chapel, in Ruth Carling's parlor, it had glinted at the edge of things. I unfolded Margaret Hale's final letter once again. The paper felt softer now, warmed by my pocket, the ink a muted violet under the lounge's yellow light. I read it slowly, lips barely moving, then read it again. The misquoted Arnold still jarred. Faith turned to farewell. A crease doubled back on an older crease. Tosca reached its half-time pause, the music stuttering in a brief silence before the next act. I caught myself humming the unresolved phrase, a habit I despise. My whiskey glass left a ring on the table like a closing compass. The clue about reversals in that morning's crossword returned to me. 5 letters, metamorphosis, turn. I had written volte, thinking of the dance step that shifts direction mid-measure. I lowered my eyes to the letter. Something in the margins caught the lamplight, the faint upward tails of each line's first letter. An old habit of mine, to look at the skeleton before the flesh. I took a pencil from my coat and wrote the initials in a column on the hotel notepad. They spelled a name. Not complete, but enough to tighten the air around me. A person half hidden in plain sight, present in the register on the day of Margaret's last lecture under a false initial. The whiskey burned softer now. I leaned back, letting Tosca's voice fill the space between deduction and dread. The scene of the death replayed itself in my head. Burgundy half gone, tea untouched, a letter folded twice. A tableau, not a tragedy. Someone had staged despair like an opera set at half-time, each prop placed to imply a mood rather than express it. I thought of the cellar master's ledger, the ink blurred where a page had been closed too soon. I thought of Blythe's ledger with the folded invoice, of Father Kershaw correcting the verse and then misquoting it again in chapel, of Ruth's invented train journey. Reversals all, wine where tea should be, farewell where faith belonged, arrivals without departures. Outside the window the rain had stopped, leaving the street lamps haloed. People passed with their coats drawn tight, faces blurred in reflection. I felt the peculiar ache that comes when the shape of a pattern emerges, but its meaning stays just out of reach. Like hearing a key change in an opera you have listened to all your life without realizing it was a key change at all. I folded the letter back along its creases, aligning the old fold with the new, as though joining past and present. In my notebook I wrote only 2 words. Name hidden. Then beneath it I drew a small circle and wrote reversal inside. The glass of whiskey sat untouched for a moment longer. Then I drank. The recording of Tosca began again from the start, the soprano's voice entering with a softness that was almost a whisper. Half-time was over. The opera moved toward its next act. I felt the investigation shift in the same way, a quiet turning of the stage before the curtain rose again. When I left the Randolph, the night air smelled of wet stone and distant smoke. In my coat pocket, the letter waited, its secret no longer entirely secret, but not yet revealed. The pavement shone like an empty staff waiting for notes. I walked back toward the college, the aria still in my head, thinking of reversals, of hidden names, and of a bottle of Burgundy taken from the wrong crate. I found Father Kershaw in the vestry at twilight, the chapel emptied of its choir boys, the echo of their last notes still trembling in the beams. Candles guttered low, leaving the scent of wax and damp stone. He stood at a narrow table sorting hymn sheets into 2 uneven piles, lips moving faintly as though rehearsing a sermon he would never give. Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist that clung to the windows like a veil. I told him quietly that I had come about the letter. He did not look up at once, only smoothed the edge of the paper with his thumb. His hands bore a faint tremor. When at last he spoke, his voice was lower than I had expected, a confession rehearsed so many times it had worn smooth. He said he had written it. Not the words exactly, those were Margaret's, he said, but the arrangement, the misquote, the absence of a signature. He had done it to protect someone else. He had believed she had ended her own life. He paused then, as though listening to the silence for judgment. The candles spat a thin hiss. I asked who he had been protecting. He said he would not name them, not yet. He had only wished to shape the narrative into something the college could endure. His eyes drifted to the crucifix on the wall, not in prayer, but in a kind of weary negotiation. I let him speak. He described how Margaret had come to him days before her death, pale but resolute, carrying a sheaf of papers and a small envelope. She had spoken of betrayal, of a long-buried scandal, of debts she could no longer pay in silence. He had thought she was confessing despair, not preparing for confrontation. The letter he forged was his attempt to close the wound she had opened. The chapel floor creaked under my step. I told him he had succeeded only in confusing the living. He said perhaps confusion was gentler than truth. The smell of candle wax clung to his sleeve again, and a smudge of ink stained his cuff near the wrist, as though he had wiped a pen hastily. I took from my coat the draft of Margaret's will. In the margin, the witness signature bore a similar smear, a loop blurred where the pen had stuttered and been dragged. The same ink, the same shade. I turned the page toward him. He glanced at it only briefly before lowering his eyes. "That is not my hand," he murmured. For a moment, the vestry felt colder. Another false solution collapsing, like a building whose scaffolding has been quietly removed. Kershaw was guilty of forgery, but not of death. He had shaped a story, but not the act at its center. Yet in his hesitation, in the ink at his cuff and the way his gaze flickered not to the signature but to the blank space beside it, I felt the faint tremor of a different truth. The witness name meant nothing but the absence of a surname on the beneficiary, the blurred loop of the pen, small, almost petty clues, now pointed away from him toward someone who had been present but hidden. I thanked him without warmth. He looked at me as though asking whether confession without absolution still counted. His hands hovered above the hymn sheets, then settled. He said softly that Margaret had deserved better friends than the ones she had chosen. Outside, the mist had turned to a drizzle again. I walked the cloister slowly, the sound of my steps swallowed by stone. The coded poem lay folded in my pocket, the letters of the hidden name like a heartbeat I could feel, but not yet hear. Somewhere behind me the organ gave a single testing chord, then stopped. I reached the gate and paused. The ink smear on the will, so easily overlooked, now pulsed at the edge of my thoughts like a low note beneath a melody. It was not proof, only direction, but it drew me toward the real culprit with the inevitability of a key change in music long memorized. I closed my eyes, felt the drizzle on my face, and thought of the cup still full, the bottle emptied, the play performed for an audience unaware it was being watched. I can still see that room as if it were a photograph left too long in a drawer, its colors dulled, its edges soft, the air inside it faintly tasting of paper and old flowers. Margaret Hale's rooms had been tidied by the scouts since her death, but the shape of that last evening clung to the furniture. The narrow bed pressed to the wall, the small table under the lamp, the teacup still on its saucer, full to the brim, though the liquid had cooled to an uninviting brown. Beside it, the burgundy bottle, drained past its half, its neck tilted like a throat offered up. They gathered where I asked them to gather, Latimer leaning against the window frame, restless fingers on the sill, Helen Dacre clasping her satchel as if it were a talisman. Father Kershaw seated upright, eyes fixed on some invisible horizon. Ruth carling behind the door, her expression caught between anger and exhaustion. Edward Blythe took the armchair nearest the table, his cuff brushing the teacup when he sat down. He gave a small start at the contact, then smiled too quickly. Lois stood at my shoulder but said nothing. The fire in the grate had burned low, casting a weak glow. The room smelled faintly of tea leaves, candle wax, and something sharper. The ghost of wine, perhaps. I spoke quietly, more to the room than to them. I told them about the letter folded twice, about the false initial in the register, about the will altered 2 days before the death. I spoke of the coded poem whose first letters spelled a name, and how those letters had led me back to the burgundy crate reserved for donors. No one moved. Outside, the quad's bell sounded the quarter hour, the notes spilling through the open window like a reminder of time spent. I looked at Blythe then. His hand rested on the arm of the chair, thumb rubbing the fabric in small nervous circles. I said that the scene in this room had been composed like a still life, the cup to suggest calm, the bottle to suggest despair. In truth, the wine had been drugged and the tea poured for steadiness. Margaret had confronted him with proof of his past embezzlement tied to the old student scandal, and he had tried to quiet her. The full cup and the empty bottle were not her contradictions, but his. Blythe did not confess. He did not protest either. His lips moved once as though shaping a word that never came. The bursar, who had spoken so smoothly of college finances, now stared at the floorboards. His eyes flicked toward the window where Latimer stood, then away. Helen's satchel creaked as she shifted. Ruth pressed her hand to her mouth, but made no sound. Father Kershaw crossed himself almost imperceptibly. The candle beside him guttered, throwing his shadow high on the wall. I felt no triumph in that moment, only the dull ache of a chord resolved too late. These were people who had lived among footnotes and grants and choirs, yet their ambitions and failures had followed the same old patterns: pride, concealment, the small cruelties of clever lives. I spoke no more. The truth had been laid out like the papers on the desk, and what happened next belonged to procedures and solicitors, not to me. Lewis moved to open the door. The others filed past, silent. Blythe was last. He paused by the table, his fingers brushing the teacup once more, then left without looking back. I stayed a moment longer. The room felt emptier than when we had entered, as though even the air had withdrawn. I poured a little of the cold tea into the sink. Its bitterness rose to my nose. Outside, the rain had begun again, soft and persistent, a rain that polishes stone rather than erasing it. When I stepped into the quad, the lamps made small halos on the wet pavement. Lewis walked ahead, calling to the porter. I lingered under the arch. Mahler's adagios came to mind. The slow rise, the faltering, the unfinished yearning. In the photograph from the archive, Margaret had been smiling faintly. Now only this quiet room remained, this still life of a cup and a bottle, a life spent and a life emptied. I left Oxford that night with the taste of bitter tea still at the back of my throat.